remember when I first started there, because I came from crime scene. I was a crime scene investigator, and then I was hired onto this contract. And we would go out and work a crime scene, and we would take an hour, 2 hours to process a crime scene. And when I very first started there, they were like, well, we teach them to process a scene in 15 minutes or less. And I was like, that's not possible.
Hey there, my name's Ashley Church.
And I'm Erin West.
We were once newly promoted crime scene and latent print supervisors on mutual struggle buses as we both simultaneously tried to navigate through the challenges within our forensic units.
Now we run a business where we create tools and resources that we wish we had had to make these transitions easier. We like to talk about the experiences we've had in the forensic field, the good, the bad, and the ugly, in the hopes to create awareness around these issues and move the needle forward to create positive change in the forensic community.
So if you're a forensic professional, regardless of your years of experience, who's not afraid to dive into real, raw, and sometimes uncomfortable topics, you're in the right place.
This is the Forensics Unfiltered Podcast.
Before we start this episode, our guests would like to share a disclaimer that the opinions shared are their own and not representative of their current or past employment. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Hi, guys. Welcome back to another episode of Forensics Unfiltered. We're so excited to have you guys back here with us. Today, we have a very special guest and one of our fabulous instructors, Michael Kessler. And Ashley wasn't able to make it on with us today, so it's just going to be Kessler and I. We're very excited to talk about this topic. We've not yet talked about this on our podcast, but we're going to talk a little bit about military forensic contracts today. We're going to go through some of the pros and cons of our own experience. Both Kessler and I worked for some different military contracts throughout the course of our career, and honestly didn't even know they existed when I went to college. But before we do, Kessler, can you give our listeners a little rundown of your background, where you started to where you are now?
Sure. So I grew up and started my career in Massachusetts. I actually started in a county jail working for a sheriff's office. From there, went through the police academy, went and was part of our law enforcement division for a little bit, worked for a municipal police department for a while, and really got interested in the forensics. And up in Massachusetts, most of the major crime scenes, as you're getting into homicides, things like that, are worked by the state police. And that was really where my interest was going. But I really didn't want to go through another police academy, be on the road for a couple of years, and then maybe get into crime scene. So I made a big leap and moved to Texas and worked for the Austin Police Department for a couple of years and worked crime scenes there, got that experience, and then actually met my wife when I was working there and moved into New Mexico, where my wife was from. She was going to school in Texas. And I actually was born in New Mexico and had family there, worked for a department, did some internal affairs work, and then some white collar crime inspector general work. Wasn't really too enthused with it and really wanted to get back into forensics. And I had known and seen some of the things that were coming out about the military forensics. And again, when we talk about military forensics, and I'm sure we'll get more into this, it's more for the intelligence side than actually like law enforcement prosecution side. So I started looking at those contracts and was able to get picked up by one contract and worked for a company supporting the National Ground Intelligence Center in Virginia. So I moved from New Mexico to Virginia. I worked on that contract for, I believe it was about 2 years, deployed twice on that contract, moved into another contract after coming back home where we were training special operations in what they call site exploitation, which is essentially, for those law enforcement folks, thinks of like your SWAT team doing a crime scene in 15 minutes in a hostile area. So very much intelligence related.
That's a great way to explain it, yeah.
Yes, that's how I've always explained it, and it seems to hit for the law enforcement folks. But there's actually different levels of what they call exploitation. So there's actually on-site all the way up to like a reach-back capability, which Erin will talk about, which she worked in that type of capacity as well. So after training for 2 years, I got picked up on another contract working for another special operations command and did some deployable work, but also when I wasn't deployed, I was very lucky to be doing a lot of research and development type support, more from the user side, but also getting involved with a lot of really smart people at different government labs, to include the Army's crime lab in Fort Gillem, Georgia. I was involved with that and also was deployed 3 more times while I was working on that contract to support different operations throughout the world. In my deployable time as a contractor, I started in 2009 as a contractor, and up till about 2021 was actually a contractor. But the first 5.5 years, I deployed 5 times. I went to Iraq once, Afghanistan 3 times, and then Somalia was my last one. Got to spend 6 months in Mogadishu, so that was quite interesting. After I deployed, I came back and actually worked for a private company that was part of the research and development that I was doing, Rapid DNA Company, which is now known as Andy, and did a lot of support to the military units that I actually had been supporting directly as well. From there, moved to Florida International University and what used to be the National Forensic Science Technology Center, now the Global Forensic and Justice Center. And they do a lot of government contracting as well, again, with a lot of Special Operations Command, which is headquartered in the Tampa area where GFJC is as well. And I was able to do a lot more contracting work as well, more doctrine, training. I actually worked for a whole year on a project where we created a handbook for 5 nations called Five Eyes, which is actually a intelligence sharing classification. So US, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand work very much together internationally with forensic and technical intelligence. And I was able to lead the program and be a co-author of that handbook to bring together those 5 nations and how they do the forensic and technical, what they call exploitation or the investigation with that material. And then worked projects similar to that through March of 2021, where I took a job local to where I've lived since 2015. So I worked as the forensics manager for the Denton Police Department here in North Texas and oversee forensic services, evidence management, as well as our digital forensics unit. So I've kind of been back in the law enforcement realm for a while, but still kind of keep my toes and do a little bit of consulting on the side, have my toes in lots of things. I work a lot in standards.
You do have your toes in a lot of things, for sure.
Yes, I almost need more feet. I have my toes in lots of things. I teach academically for Florida International. I teach professionally for Gap Science, and then do all sorts of other things.
You're on OSAC?
Yes, currently I've been involved with OSAC, the Organization of Scientific Area Committees for Forensic Science. I've been involved since 2016, starting with the Crime Scene Investigation Subcommittee, moved up through leadership positions there, and then this October, I was nominated to sit as the chair of the Scene Examination Committee and also as a member of the Forensic Science Standards Board, which kind of oversees the work of the entire body with the assistance of the program office as well.
What a wealth of knowledge, for sure, and so much life experience packed into a short 20-year range. So many of you guys listening already know me and know my story. I also started in forensics back in 2006, and I ended up becoming a government contractor in 2010. So it sounds like just a year after you became a government contractor. Now, when I started in forensics, I did not know that those types of contracts existed. I thought you either worked for a private lab or you worked for law enforcement. That was pretty much what you did. My eyes were very much open to that whole entire world that I didn't know existed. And we talked about this earlier. It probably really didn't exist too much. Like, it started becoming a large thing around those times with the wars that were going on and all of that. And so how did you fall into that world? Were you aware of it? Did somebody bring you into that world? Where did you find those initial jobs? How did you end up in that world?
So in 2007, I was lucky enough, back pre the recession of 2008, 2009, the FBI had a program where they would bring state and local law enforcement folks to Quantico, to the lab or to the academy, if you will, and train them in a whole slew of different things, anything from scene-based stuff, lab-based stuff. And it was a great program. They actually paid for everything except for your salary. And I was lucky enough to be able to get into the post-blast investigation school. And at the time, I knew what it was. I didn't really understand the utility of it. I think a lot of people didn't put in for it. So that's why I was able to get into it, honestly. But throughout that course, right, in 2007, we had Iraq going on, Afghanistan going on. If you're familiar with those conflicts, a lot of the weapons that were used against our forces and the coalition forces were improvised explosive devices. So we learned a lot about that in that training. But also one of the presenters was actually from the Armed Forces Medical Examiner, where they were showing post-blast injuries and things like that from our soldiers and warfighters that were overseas, and the damage that blasts can do to people. And that kind of opened my eyes to what was going on with forensics and what we were doing overseas with that. And the IAI job site, the International Association for Identification, on their website, they have that job posting site. And I'd kind of seen those weird jobs where you're like, I don't even know what that means, right? Like you said, what is a contractor? I don't even understand what this is. You either work for a private company or you work for
no description of the job either. Like,
right.
All of those jobs still to this day don't really tell you what you're going to be doing for good reason.
Because they can't, right?
Yeah,
because a lot of what we did was very much classified. So it was just something when I kind of started looking about a year before I actually got a job as a contractor. I had applied and gone through the whole process and everything with a different company and then heard nothing. Interviews, all these things, and like, this is great. They flew me to their headquarters and then I heard nothing. And what Aaron and I had talked about before is a lot of times these government contract companies, the way that the process works to be able to bid on it, they have to say, we have these people lined up, here's their skills, we have their resumes, they've signed letters of intent, they're going to come work for us if we get this contract. And all the companies that are bidding on that have to have that package. So they may not win the contract and you'll just never hear from them again. So that happened to me, and I didn't really think anything of it. I just thought it was weird and moved on and applied with another company and just only did a phone interview with that one. They didn't fly me out anywhere. And I think like 2 or 3 weeks later, I moved from New Mexico to Virginia and off I went on my crazy adventure. And again, not fully probably really understanding everything that was involved.
Yeah.
Because it wasn't the height of contracting, but I mean, it's been pretty steady going ever since. There's been lulls, but it's ebbed and flowed, but it's mostly
let's talk about that, because I had a similar experience. What you said is true, I think, for a lot of contracting. So these individual companies, if they want a government contract, they have to bid for it. And they have to have the entire contract has to be ready at the time of bidding. So they have to know who all of their employees will be, because basically if they win the contract, it starts right away. They have to hire all these people right away. And so I did a similar thing where I applied and went through the whole process, and I didn't hear anything for like a year, to the point where I had even kind of like forgotten that I'd applied, because I was like, whatever, I just moved on with my life. And then they called one day, and I want to say it was like a Thursday, and I lived in Florida and the contract was in Virginia. And they were like, we need you to start on Monday. And I was like, dude, I can't start on Monday, you know? So like, and it sounds like his experience was very similar, where when he finally got hired, he had to move across the country immediately. Like, it was rapid. And for me, it was the same. I did end up accepting the job, but I had to move. Like, I had to drop my life and move from Florida to Virginia in like a 2-week time frame. I did tell them they wanted me to start on Monday, and I was like, I can't. I have to give my job 2 weeks. But basically, I had to give them 2 weeks immediately and then move. So I would guess that probably a lot of people have had a similar experience. And did you find, as you moved from contract to contract, that was very similar? Like, they picked you up very quickly?
Yes. Yeah. They definitely don't want to have vacancies on the contracts, because a lot of the contracts will. So there's either two things. Either they're not getting the money coming in because they don't have that person on the payroll, right? They don't get the money unless somebody's working. And then also in some contracts, if they have spots gapped, they get penalized for those. That's why they always try to have people kind of in the chute, but also where they're very quick to move if they want to hire you.
Yeah, they will constantly have people in the chute. Basically, they're constantly pulling in people and running them through backgrounds and everything, and having them waiting. And the second a spot opens, they hire them and they fill the spots immediately. So you guys will see IAI is a good one, where there's job postings for some of the different contracts. They won't have a lot of description about what the job is, and you probably will never really see that. But when they're ready to hire, they hire for sure. I only worked for 2 different contractors, and both of those were the same. The second contract, when they picked me up from the first one, it was the same thing. It was like a Wednesday, and they wanted me to start on Monday. So it was like an immediate transfer to a new job. So that's definitely something that comes along with that. So once you got into contracting, What were some of the things that you maybe were like surprised about when you transitioned from law enforcement over to that contracting side?
Have you heard about The Vault? It's the first ever membership exclusively for forensic training, and we have packed it full of goodies. So, get this. You get instant access to over 20 webinar replays on everything from landing a job in forensics to field training to supervision. But that's not all. We're also throwing in some of our top e-courses, our Field Training Officer Virtual Academy, and exclusive Forensic Supervisor Success kits from past virtual summits. And guess what? You get everything mentioned for just $29 a month, or you can grab a whole year for only $300. And we know many forensic professionals lately are paying for their own training, so we want to make sure training is affordable and accessible for everyone. There is fresh content every month, and that also makes it an endless learning opportunity for you. So it's a no-brainer. Join the Vault today and be part of the forensic education revolution. I'll include the link in our show notes, or you can head to our website to learn more. Don't miss out. Unlock your potential with the Vault.
What were some of the things that you maybe were like surprised about when you transitioned from law enforcement over to that contracting side?
So for me, I had never been in the military. I'd been in law enforcement, like I said, since I was actually in high school. And just the difference of pace of everything was so different, right? The hiring process, they get you kind of like thrown right in. There's no real lag time. The first contract I was on, Aaron and I actually worked for the same company, but on different contracts out of the same area. So the contract I was on was a deployable contract, but when we weren't deployed, there was a plethora of different things that we did to include providing training. So, I mean, I started on a Monday, and probably within a week or two, I was traveling all around the country, training soldiers, war fighters at different bases. And it was, even for me, just I'd provided training, in my previous jobs, but it was just so interesting. And I presume it was the same on your contract because it was very similar. We kind of handed over the training from our contract to yours. Having as a presenter to memorize your presentation, you couldn't look at notes. You couldn't even turn around and look at your slides. And this wasn't our company saying this. This was the government lead defining how we were going to do that training. So it was just a totally different tempo. Once I deployed, the tempo of how we were processing cases, and when we were overseas, a lot of the stuff that we were doing overseas was more of a triage and quick look at the evidence, and then it would go back to a reach back lab and get more further documentation and things like that. But we were still doing a fairly thorough look at everything and looking at it from multiple angles as far as different disciplines. But just the resources that were available to us, the amount of equipment that we had, the amount of resources that we had. Yeah.
Yes. So many resources. And I think I had a similar experience. So he was talking about he did site exploitation. That was also the first contract that I joined. So I also traveled to the different military bases, and we trained the soldiers that were getting ready to deploy basically how to process a site, an IED site overseas forensically. And I remember when I first started there, because I came from crime scene. I was a crime scene investigator, and then I was hired onto this contract. And we would go out and work a crime scene, and we would take an hour, 2 hours to process a crime scene. And when I very first started there, they were like, well, we teach them to process a scene in 15 minutes or less. And I was like, that's not possible. It is not possible to do that, because in my mind, everything that we had to do, it takes too long. You can't do it in 15 minutes. And so they had done studies that essentially, if they were there past the 10-minute mark, the chance of them being injured or killed rose significantly. So they trained them to process the site in 15 minutes or less. And their theory behind it was, if you learn how to process it quickly and you have more time, you can always take more time. If you learn how to process something in a really long amount of time and you have to cut it down, you can't do that. We don't do very well with that. And the theory behind that is so good. The things that they could do in 15 minutes was wild. They would take photographs, they would do their overall mid-range close-up, they would process for prints, they would collect standards, they would collect evidence, they would do initial and final sweeps for evidence and stuff like that, all in 15 minutes. And it was crazy to see it. They would be running. But by the end of the training, we started them with small buildings, like a single room, and then we would work them up to where they would do like an entire building. And they would have a team of maybe 6 or 7 guys would process a like 7-8 room building in 15 minutes or less by the end of the training. It was wild. So when he's talking about just like the resources and the efficiency of everything is so streamlined and well thought out and structured. And that was such a shock for me to come from regular crime scene into this and be like, well, I took an hour and a half to work a burglary, and these guys are working these cases in, 15 minutes. I mean, they're running like we wouldn't run through a crime scene. They're really hauling ass in there, but it was pretty amazing to watch. And it was a stark difference from what we're used to. Did you find that to be true when you first saw it? You were like, whoa.
Yes, I had the same feeling where they were like, oh yeah, 15 minutes. And I was like, there's no way that they'll be able to do this. And it's kind of neat having been involved as long as I was, but even just how they kind of iteratively identified technologies that would and wouldn't work. When they first started doing that program, we came from the crime scene world. So we give them a digital SLR camera with interchangeable lenses, all that. And they quickly found that was a great way to break cameras. And we were actually pushed forward on a lot of the ruggedized cameras. And, again, I was able to do research and development in some of my jobs. But the money to create new technology and better equipment for those specific mission sets also kind of came out of that too. So it was interesting. You would have never thought that you could use a ruggedized point and shoot camera. Obviously the technology's come a long way in that time, but just being able to get the quality and being able to make efficiencies to work with that equipment because the environment didn't allow it. The stories that I was told early on, a lot of the people that were traditional law enforcement people were trying to push a lot of this is the way we've always done it, right? It's our mantra in law enforcement, unfortunately. But trying to push either techniques or equipment, things like that. And it just didn't work, but they were able to adapt and overcome those issues, whether it was through new technology, through new techniques, to really kind of change that up. So it was really neat to see that. And I've seen a lot of my peers that I had either non-deployable or deployable positions who've come from law enforcement, went into that military forensics piece, and then came back out. And it's really interesting how many of them have really excelled in their careers. And I think a lot of that is being able to, it just kind of changes your mindset, that frame that you're
makes
used
you very
to.
flexible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it makes you very flexible.
Yeah, flexible, and you build your own path, right? Especially as a contractor where it's not as bad as there's no promise for tomorrow, but contracts end. It's a contract. It's not a government job, and it's not meant to be funded for an exceptional amount of time, or maybe it is, but it's not always at the time that it's currently funded projected to last for 10 or 15 years. That's why it's a contract as opposed to it being a government job. Essentially, what I had been told was if they couldn't project that you could essentially almost get like a career out of it, which is like 15, 20 years, it would be a contract job vice a civil service, civilian job. So it was kind of interesting. That's why those contracts exist, right? A lot of people think, it was funny when I first started contracting, people are like, oh, what do you do? And I'm like, I'm a government contractor. And they're like, so you build stuff? I'm like, no, not like a general contractor.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, there are probably some government contracts that do that, but because they don't have the need or the funding or just even that, I know a lot of the forensics capabilities that were deployed overseas, the military just didn't have that capability and didn't have the capability to create it in a short amount of time, is why contracts initially were started. And I know a lot of people are like, well, the military has forensics, right? They've had Army crime labs since actually World War II is when it really started at its base. But the difference between the pure Army crime lab and what we were doing was very different, where the pure Army crime lab is actually to police the military. That's the main focus of it. And there is some maybe counterintelligence or other pieces to it, but their larger mission is, again, to police their own. And what we were doing was very much different, and they just didn't have the capability to support it. There would be military police or the units that would support those type of missions, but it just, given the amount of things that the military was doing and is still doing, they just don't have the personnel and the resources to do that. That's why they bring in contractors.
Yeah, that's a great example. So initially, I was working on a site exploitation training team, and then those guys were deploying and they were sending back such an excessive amount of evidence that the labs got overwhelmed. So then I ended up on a contract it was like a pop-up lab. Like they took a government lab and they expanded it significantly. So whereas like initially it had maybe, 30, 40 people in the lab, they expanded it to about 450 people to accommodate all this evidence that was coming back from overseas. And they had done the calculation that before they did that lab expansion with all of the contractors, they had guesstimated that it would take them about 47 to 50 years to process all of the evidence that was coming back from overseas. So like he said, there was a need for the contractors to help flush through all that stuff. So that contract, when I joined that contract, it was anticipated to be 5 years. And I think it ended at like 3.5 because basically all the evidence was processed. And once it was processed, there was no need for the contractors anymore. So they shut down all the contractors. So that is something too that's good to know if you ever want to put in for one of these jobs. It's not permanent. It won't be there forever. It's meant to be temporary. And even if you sign on for a contract and they say, oh, this is going to be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever, I'm very much, change is very easy for me. It didn't bother me to have contracts come and go or, have things change rapidly like that, or even have to pack up and move across the country. Those kinds of things really stress my husband out. So I do feel like you have to be a little bit more fluid with those types of jobs because they're not going to be around forever and it is going to change. So for you, what were some of the pros and cons of being a contractor that you experienced?
Probably the biggest draw, and probably intentionally at that time, was the pay, right?
Yeah.
I don't remember what I was making when I left New Mexico, but it was a hearty increase to a level where I was like, wait, did y'all type that wrong? Like, what's going on?
Yes.
Again, not knowing what exactly it entailed and the reasoning behind it. But I didn't get in early, right? A lot of people I know, even when I was deployed, I would have some salty military folks that were like, you make $300,000 a year. And I was like, tell me where that job is and I will go there.
Yes.
But early on in like the Iraq conflict, there were folks that were making that. And the kind of uplift, if you will, from a civilian law enforcement person to the military contract was definitely a good little benefit. But there's reasons behind it, right? They have to pull you away from that pretty solid, stable job into the potential world of uncertainty that is contracting. So that was good. And for me, the other pro was just kind of doing something different, right? As much as crime scene is very much different every day, you can still kind of get into that rut of the same. So I liked that it was every day was pretty much different, especially overseas.
Yeah.
And getting to be closer to the tip of the spear, if you will, right? Really getting out and being part of that was huge. Think of other pros. I mean, again, I really think that it accelerated my career. It kind of catapulted me, just kind of changed me from who I had been, changed me in a good way, but, really opened my eyes to a lot of things and helped me realize I got put into a lot of lead positions early on and really helped me with my leadership. And
for sure.
A lot of great people in the military that, whether they were officers or enlisted, I talked about that one person that kind of was salty about it, but most of them aren't, and they want to learn from you and they want to teach you. And it's a really great relationship in my experience.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that kind of stuck with me too is that the cases that we were working were so significant. Not that what we do in law enforcement isn't significant, but in law enforcement, we're working a lot of vehicle burglaries and stuff like that. Whereas the stuff we were working there was really significant. I mean, we were talking about saving soldiers' lives or soldiers being killed. And like, this is the evidence that we're working in those laboratories and stuff. So the cases were a lot more significant. I also agree with the pay. I remember when they told me what my pay would be, I actually was silent on the phone. And the woman was like, "Is that rate of pay okay?" And I was just silent because I was so shocked. It was like 3 times what I made as a crime scene person. Now, listen, after I did contracting for a while, I realized I probably could have asked for more at that time, but I was so shocked at what they offered me that she was like, is that rate of pay okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's great." I also think something I learned from working these contracts is how to work with a sense of urgency, because when you go to work at one of these contracts, you are there to work all day. Every second of every day, you are pushing everything you have into the work that you're doing. And everybody is. They are machines, like efficiency machines. They are built to be efficient. They have thought of like every little thing to make things faster, better, stronger, more efficient. And I mean, everywhere you go has lazy people, but you really didn't have the opportunity to be lazy. It was so hardcore. There were no extended lunches at the Chili's. So, and even I was talking to Kessler about it earlier, the facility that I worked in, we couldn't even bring our phones in there. We couldn't bring any electronics in there. Even just having the distraction of your phone taken away, you have no idea how much time you spend on your phone throughout the day or other devices and things like that. But I learned to work so quickly and efficiently on things that when I actually went back to regular law enforcement, I was shocked how slow and inefficient we are and how much time we waste throughout the day on just, doing whatever. So did you find that to be true too, that like when you were at work, you worked?
Yes. Yeah. And I think like you kind of hinted on it, the mission was really what drives everybody and puts everybody into that mindset where if there are people that aren't pulling their weight, they're either going to get nudged to pull their weight or they're not going to be on the contract anymore. That's kind of the other good thing as well, is
Yeah.
most companies that I've seen really well regulate, again, because they're not just getting paid to do the work, they're also getting graded after, and then it has further impacts on whether or not they're able to get contracts later.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting dynamic that we're not used to, again, where you get hired into that government civilian job and you can kind of just hang out
Ghost.
sometimes.
Yeah, you can just coast. And like we had, bringing up, you would get reported on after the fact. So like in law enforcement now, we see a lot of people that are like hesitant to display stats or like keep detailed stats on their unit because like, oh, what if Sally might get mad if everybody sees that Sally's the lowest producer. The military contracts don't care. They want to see the hard numbers and you had to report them regularly. There were metrics that every contract had to hit. And so like he was saying, the sheer amount of stuff that they were able to get done just because they knew they had to hit certain metrics. Like we don't typically do that in forensics where we're like, well, you have to complete this many cases in a certain amount of time. But the fact that they did that and we're like, you have to complete this many cases every week or whatever it was, made everybody hit it. Every single person hit that mark and did it well because that was how you kept your job. So that is definitely a difference. So what were some of the cons that you experienced with contracting?
For me, I'm very much like your husband, that kind of uncertainty that we always talked about. I was always one that, I had one job and, I always was talking to a recruiter somewhere else just in case.
Yeah. It caused you a lot of anxiety.
Yes. But it was because I had heard things and, you can kind of take the temperature of what's going on with a contract and how things might transition. But the other thing, obviously, you're away from your family if you're deployed, or even if, like you and I did, where you just pick up and move across the country to take that job, which there might be some benefit as well because you have that money. So you might be able to travel back to see your family a little more. There wasn't a ton of negatives. Again, for me, the reason that I got away from the direct contracting was deployment is awesome, but I didn't want to see my kids grow up over Skype. On my last deployment, my oldest son, who's now 10, was just born. He was like 3 months old when I left. And just that change that I saw, because my last deployment was to a very austere environment. You can deploy to some places where, they have coffee shops and some
They're
places,
fancier.
depending on the base, yeah, they're very fancy. There's actually a U.S. base overseas that had a pool, and there were people that were deployed there, and you could get like scuba certified, and I was like, what in the world is this? I was not deployed there. I was transiting through there, but
That was not the base that you ended up on.
but quite interestingly, the more austere the environment got and the smaller the units that I was with, right, you get that more camaraderie. I know I'm supposed to be talking about negatives, but there was never a point where I was like, why am I doing this? This is the worst thing. Again, other than missing my family and my kids. I loved every minute of it and just left it to kind of gain back that stability and build.
Same. I would have done it for the rest of my career. I loved it. I loved the change. Most of those, well, probably all of them require some kind of clearance. So like I had the contracts I worked for, I had a top secret clearance, and those are expensive to get and maintain. So once you have one, it's very easy for you to contract hop. You know, you can go from contract to contract because they can pick you up. You already have your clearance and they can plug you right into their contract. So I gladly would have done that the rest of my career if it didn't cause my husband such extreme stress. I thought it was so fun, so interesting. I loved the challenge of it. I loved the work that we were doing. It felt very important, like we were really doing something great for the nation. I loved the efficiency of it. I loved the schedule. I loved the pay. I loved all of those things. I left for the same reason that you did, basically, was that I was just away from home too much. And that caused a lot of strain, you know, being gone. The last contract that I worked for, I made enough money that I had a fully furnished apartment in Virginia and a home in Florida. And I would fly up, work my shift. So I'd work a couple days in a row. And then on the last day of my shift, I would hop on the metro, get into the airport and hop a flight home. And then I'd be home for a couple days. And then I'd, you know, fly back, hop back on the metro and go into work. I just carried like a little bag with me because I had clothes here, clothes there, a full house here, a full house there. But over years and years and years of doing that, I did it for 5 years. That does wear down on the social structures in your life for sure. But I would totally keep doing it. I really enjoyed it. So sounds like you did too.
Yeah, and I know plenty of people that are still doing it. A lot of people that I started contracting with have moved into government jobs that actually didn't even exist when we started contracting, capabilities in different offices that have grown and really made programs out of it. And it's probably just going to continue to grow as the uncertainty in the world continues. And I think one of the kind of important points too to share with people, a lot of people are like, well, we don't get it. What is the forensics doing? What are you doing? And obviously there's a good bit of things that we can't talk too deeply about, but probably the biggest thing is, right, it's the conflicts that we're involved in now. And it's actually, interestingly, even back in World War I was able to find some documents that traced back to it when I was helping write that book, that even in World War I, you know, they would take over a trench system that was from the enemy, and they would be looking for different things, right? Things about plans, things about documents. Now we're moving towards a ununiformed adversary, right? They're not wearing a uniform and we can tell who they are. So using those same technologies and techniques that we would to identify suspects, we can use that to identify our enemy and be able to try to prevent things. We can use it to identify folks. I've actually done several studies on cases where overseas items were processed and we were able to identify the insurgents, and they were actually either tried in US courts, they were tried in Crown courts in the UK, because both the US, the UK, and other nations keep jurisdiction over anytime that you kill a US person overseas. The FBI, the US government, has said we have jurisdiction anywhere, we don't care. And in the UK, they've done the same as well, where they'll try their own citizens, things like that. So it's very interesting. There's case studies where work that we did overseas helped identify people that when they came back to the UK, there was a gentleman, and I can't recall his name, which is probably better, anyway, but he came back to the UK after going and getting his jihad on, and based on the information we developed overseas, they actually tracked him, and he tried to attack Parliament with a knife. If you're familiar with Big Ben, Big Ben's not the building, it's the clock and the bell. Parliament is the building, but there was actually a knife attack where they actually were able to stop it very quickly after it happened. So it's kind of cool how it all comes together in taking care of the immediate things, but also kind of a strategic element as well.
Yeah, so it's very similar to what we do here, processing for prints, processing for DNA, looking at digital forensics. All of those things exist. They're just applying it to a different set of people. So instead of applying it internally here to the people that live in the country, they're applying it externally. And there's also databases, just like we have here, nationwide databases. There's also databases for overseas, for prints and things like that, that they can run things through and search things for. And that's essentially what they're doing with a lot of these contracts. I know more about pieces of IEDs now than I will ever be necessary. Like the things you can make IEDs out of, I had no idea. Before I joined these contracts, if I had gone into someone's home and seen those random things like laid out on a table, it probably wouldn't have even flagged anything for me. But now I'm like, oh, washing machine timers. Okay.
Yeah, luckily the explosive part is the hard part to make. Anybody can make a switch. It's very interesting, especially in Afghanistan, where they had a lot less resources. The nature of the switches and devices were very rudimentary, but you almost kind of got to applaud them for their ingenuity for being able to take what little they had to build those.
Yeah.
Not to give them props, but you don't want to downplay your adversary and think that they're some lesser person sitting in a cave, because they can do damage with what they have as well. So
you're creative, certainly. You had mentioned earlier that you think that being part of these contracts has really kind of driven your career, and I do feel that way. I do feel like I got the opportunity to be a leader earlier in my career than I would have, and also over like really large operations. I was one of the deputy program managers for that laboratory. So I was overseeing, I think I had 8 or 9 supervisors that worked in different departments. And I had about 100 people on my shift that I was overseeing. And that was pretty fresh in my career. I don't even think I was 30 yet. So just to have that exposure of having to run a lab like that taught me a lot about being a leader and a supervisor. But one of the things that I think I've become pretty good at, and I really think that I got it from these contracts, is the military is very good at recognizing inefficiencies and then putting something in place to fix it immediately. So they are very good at looking and saying, like, this thing is wasting time. Like, how can we change that? And the lab and even the site exploitation team, you talked a little bit about the cameras, like, oh, they wanted to use these cameras. They learned really quickly those cameras didn't work. And then they immediately implemented something new, something better, faster, whatever. They don't stall on that. When they see a problem, they're just like, we need to fix this right here. And the laboratory was built that way too, where every single thing was made specifically with the thought of making the process more streamlined and efficient. And I've found throughout my career now that I do that all the time. I'll be in the lab and I'm like, that is a bottleneck. What can we do to get rid of that? And people will be like, well, it costs money, or we don't have this, we don't have that. Like, no, there's a solution. This is not working for us. Like, what can we do to fix this? And I do that all the time now, because that's just kind of when you're in that environment for years and years and years, where it's just like, this isn't working, let's change it, and change it now before we waste years of time on this thing that's obviously a time suck. Do you think that you do that too? Has that kind of been ingrained?
Absolutely, because it's such a more dynamic environment, right? The law enforcement world has been around for a while. Where your lab is, or your crime scene unit, it's, as you talk about the leadership, right? It's getting better, but it's still not amazing for non-sworn. The pathway to move up is generally very small, but that dynamic environment where they just need to plug people in. And if you showed leadership acumen or you've proven it before, put you in and here you go. Here's the task. I remember early on, I was made lead of a team and they said, all right, we need to be able to do this. And I was like, okay, how do you want me to do that? And they said, do it. And
You figure it out. Yeah.
You just have to figure it out. You use the resources, the little bit of context that I had made and, made it work, made it happen. And obviously that was a huge confidence boost and for my leadership ability, but also to really understand how to be able to be resourceful like that and be able to make those quick changes. Coming from law enforcement, everything is very much slow. There's long procurement cycles where you can't just, this camera doesn't work for what we're doing. We're going to buy something else and we're going to field it. Like you said, we don't have the money for that, or it's going to cause this. But just being able to make that happen and being able to just build something that hasn't existed is a great skill as well. But I think too, where you were talking about the labs and being so efficient, I think a lot of that too was that it didn't exist before. So there was no right way to do it. And there was also no wrong way to do it. So you were able to just find that right way. And I think we need to try to continue, like you said you have, and I do as well, continue to just try to push that envelope and be able to move past those things and really break out of this is the way we've always done it. And just that switch of mindset of being able to be outside of what's normal or just being able to fail. I know in forensics, and it's gotten better again, but we were a no failure, right? Everything was infallible. Everything was 100%. And even just our systems and the way that we operated, we were fearful of failure. But I think we both learned to fail fast, right? And then be able to change.
Pick yourself up and move on.
Yep. Just it's not failure. It's just you found a wrong way to do it. There's right ways to do it. And you just move towards that as opposed to sitting there and going, oh my gosh, I can't believe we failed at this. Because you didn't have time to, because the mission continued. You can't sit there in that failure. You have to move on and be able to continue the mission, because it's no fail missions. Because like you said, it's very important work that we were doing. Not to say that the work we're doing now is not important, but I think we were able to bring that back with us as well and really understand that continuing to push the mission, these are no fail missions as well, and have that mindset with us.
Love it. Love it. Love it. So for those that are listening, if they would be interested in hunting down some of these jobs, where can they go to find them? I know I have personally seen there's still a lot of jobs at the Army Crime Lab seems to be hiring all the time. So those are the ones in Fort Gillem, Georgia, if you see those out there. But I do believe most of those ones also in the job description says that they're deployable. So those people are working in the lab and then also rotating out of deployments in different areas. I don't know where they're deploying to now. I know that I recently had a friend who deployed to Kenya, but I know that they're sending them to all different kinds of random places. So that's one. I have also seen some postings in Charlottesville. I don't know what they're doing up there, but they have been hiring for some DNA and latents and stuff up there. And I used to live in Charlottesville and it is beautiful. I would 10 out of 10 move back there in a second. So I know that those exist as well. And really the DC area, there's tons of stuff in the Virginia, West Virginia area. But if they wanted to find some of those jobs, where might they go to scope them out?
So I know that my experience, and also I've kind of just, I post jobs there now, so I keep an eye on it. And on the IAI's job site, the IAI.org, International Association for Identification, that job site there. There's also some specific like clearance, I think it's called clearance jobs. I haven't looked in a while, but they have had jobs similar as well. Or even if you're looking for a government job.
The usajobs.gov. Yeah.
Yes, and it is definitely a lot easier to get into a government job. If you are a contractor, they'll bring you in, right? You're a known entity at that point. So if people are even looking to get into a government job, it may be a good pathway as well if you're having difficulties getting into what you want there.
Yeah, I know a lot of the contractors from our contracts ended up with like a permanent government job, like a GS job after that. Quite a few of them are still working for federal agencies. So
Yeah, and I know quite a few that are still contractors, honestly. So the kind of hopefully not doom and gloom that we laid out of the uncertainty at times of it isn't fully fleshed out. Sometimes you may have to wait a little bit, but some companies will keep you on overhead sometimes, depending on what they have on the horizon. But it's not a barren landscape for sure. There's generally something else that you can pick up. And I know people that have moved on to other things. They became intelligence analysts or other things as well. So
yeah,
I'm trying to think of
got out of forensics entirely, but are working something else in the contracting world for sure. Yeah.
There's several different kind of big contractors out there that may have different jobs. And I know for some people, when you look even at the IAI jobs website, you'll see the same job with multiple employers. Sometimes you'll have a prime contractor with subcontractors. So they actually have the same contract.
Yeah.
So that's good information to have. Sometimes if you can find the prime contractor, they'll pay a little more than the subcontractors do. Nowadays, it's changed a little bit where even the government is kind of setting the rates of what contractors will make as well. So it's a dynamic environment as far as how the contracts go as well. Yeah, there's plenty of places out there that they're posting them because they're trying to cast a wide net to get folks.
Yeah. So if you're interested in a new adventure, those are out there if you didn't know they existed. I did not know they existed until I got into them, but I really enjoyed my experience working as a contractor. So if you can handle the rapid changing and all of that comes along with contracting, it could be a good option for you. Any other thoughts before we hop off?
I guess the only other thing is, right, we talked about security clearance. Obviously, you need to hopefully have kept your nose clean, if you will, throughout your journey in law enforcement.
For sure.
Because they will be doing a very thorough background, probably even more thorough than most law enforcement agents, most state and local law enforcement.
They do a deep dive.
Yeah, they talk to your neighbors. If you've never talked to your neighbors, they will talk to your neighbors. They
like face to face.
Yes, face to face.
Like they came and interviewed my husband. He was my boyfriend at the time. Face to face. Him, coworkers, neighbors, my best friend came and actually did interviews with them. And the clearance took a really long time. I think they brought me in with a temporary clearance, something like that. But then finishing the clearance I feel like it took like a year. It was a really long time to go through that whole process. But they deep dive on your whole background, your finances, everybody that you know. I think they even asked him if I knew anybody from like Afghanistan or Iraq, something like that at the time. I don't even know. It was like they dug deep on all the things.
Yes.
So yeah.
And depending on the level, you could have to do polygraph, whether it's a counterintelligence polygraph or a full scope polygraph, where they ask you all sorts of fun and interesting questions about your lifestyle. But again, it's for good purpose because we're trying to keep our country secure and safe.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. And then, when you do get it, and then you'll go work in a facility that's equally as intense. Like we had to secure our cell phones outside. They were cell phone lockers. And then they could do random like bag searches, which they did. They did random bag searches, but they were looking for you couldn't bring USBs in, hard drives, anything like that. We couldn't have any streaming, sometimes you'll sit at your computer and play streaming music in the background. We couldn't have any of that stuff. I'm not even certain that we had unsecured internet access there.
Yeah, no smartwatches.
Yeah, none of that stuff. So we had CDs. They would burn CDs and play CDs in the lab because they couldn't you couldn't listen to your phone or anything like that. You didn't have your phone with you. And then every day, at the end of the day, we would pull the hard drives out of every computer in the building and secure them inside a vault. And then we would leave. And then the next morning, we would pull all the hard drives out of the vault and put them back into the computer. So you couldn't even, those weren't even left sitting out. So it was pretty interesting. Definitely a different experience from now, working at the department, people just leave their computer wide open with their screen unlocked and just walk away and just leave it open. We were locking up everyone's computers every night. So definitely a different beast for sure. So thank you for joining us today, Kessler, and sharing all of your knowledge.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And if they want to reach out to you with any questions or talk to you further about your experience or anything in current forensics, where can they reach out to you?
So as I'm happily a member of the Gap Science family, you can reach me at Kessler@gapscience.com. I'm also, if you're part of the circle community for Gap Science, I'm on there as well. So if you pin me, tag me, I don't know what the proper nomenclature of it is, I'll see that as well.
Awesome. Love it. So if you guys have any questions for him, you can reach him there or in the circle community. We will post some information in the show notes about the different sites where you can find some of these jobs if you're interested in that. And we thank you guys for joining us again. And we'll see you guys at the next podcast episode. Bye.
Thank you so much for being here and listening to Forensics Unfiltered. If you liked this episode, would you do us a favor and leave a review letting us know specifically what you liked about this topic? It will only take a minute, but it will really help us plan future episodes so we can bring you more topics that you want to listen to. We'll be sure to provide any links from today's episode in our show notes on our website. Head to www.gapscience.com. Until next time, stay safe out there.